everybody, and welcome to the 2021 Threat Detection Report launch event. We have a lot to cover today, so I am going to go ahead and jump right into this. My name is Brian Donahue. I am a senior security specialist at Red Canary and one of the authors of the 2021 Threat Detection Report. Today, on this webinar, over the next hour or so, I will be joined by the Red Canary Directors of Threat Intelligence, Threat Research, and Open Source Programs. They are Katie Nichols, Matt Graber, and Adam Mashinchi, respectively. I will also be joined by Shane Welcher from our detection engineering team, and Aaron Didier, who is an analyst on our intelligence team. Now, what you can expect us to cover over the next hour are a brief introduction to the 2021 Threat Detection Report, which will be led by myself. Basically, we're going to cover why we write the report, some of the methodology behind it, including where the data comes from, and we'll close off this section with highlights before we transition over to Katie Nichols and Aaron Didier. They're going to cover the intelligence and analysis section, which, among other things, is going to include an in-depth analysis of a couple of our top threat groups from this year. One is TA551, the other is a Trojan you might have heard of called Qbot. After that, we're going to bounce back to myself and Shane Welcher. We're going to talk about visibility and detection, and we are going to use some Qbot, some scheduled task tradecraft that Qbot uses as kind of a jumping off point to talk more broadly about detection and collection strategies. Last, but certainly not least, I'm going to hand things off to Adam Mashinchi and Matt Graber, and they're going to use atomic red team tests as a demonstration for how you can generate telemetry that sort of emulates the techniques that we're talking about today, and how you can use that telemetry to figure out if you are able to gain visibility and eventually detect the threats that we cover in the threat detection report. So first of all, why do we write this report at all? Well, it all kind of arose from a question that we used to get asked a lot. And that question was, how do I get started with MITRE ATT&CK, right? So security teams, they understand the matrix, which is right there, but they didn't necessarily know how to go from sort of using the terms to using it for broader objectives like expanding detection coverage, right? It can be a little overwhelming. There's 250 some boxes in the MITRE ATT&CK matrix. So what we tried to answer, the answer we tried to provide to how you should get started with MITRE ATT&CK is prevalence-based, right? You need to sort out which things, which threats, which techniques are most prevalent. Then from there, you figure out which data sources will provide you the best visibility into those threats and those techniques. Then you talk about specific detection analytics that you can use to alert on those techniques. And then finally, you have to tie this all together and kind of check your math, so to speak, by figuring out if you've actually implemented your security controls in a way that they will work in the real world. And that's where sort of our atomic red team and testing sections come into play. So those are fundamentally the objectives of why we wrote the report. It's been pretty static year over year. So if you read the 2019 report or the 2020 report, you can expect a lot of the same out of the 2021 report, with a few important exceptions. One is that our analysis is much more granular this year. And this is due in large part to a change that MITRE ATT&CK made on their side. So when they incorporated sub-techniques over the summer, that really empowered us to scope our analysis and our detection and collection strategies a lot more tightly. And now we have a much more accurate picture of like what a technique is and what it encompasses. The other very, very large change that we made this year is a result of our intelligence team sort of maturing over the last year or two. So while historically the report has been fundamentally a list of the top techniques that we observe across our customer base, since we've been able to associate our confirmed threat detections with actual threats in the wild, we now have a second top 10 list here, which is the top 10 threats we observed over the last year. Finally, after last year, we got some feedback that people really like the PDF form of this report. So we went ahead and we created a PDF version of the report this year, as well as the web layout version of the report that you might be familiar with from last year. So before we get started, we need to briefly talk about the data upon which this report is based. So primarily, we gather the data for this report from Red Canary's managed detection and response product. So we gather telemetry, 400 billion pieces of it, in fact, a day from our customers' endpoints. We then parse that telemetry against a library of detection analytics. There are 2,000 or 3,000 detection analytics that our engine relies on. This is a living set of detection analytics that are updated, removed, added on a continuous basis. These are developed by our detection engineering team. So when the telemetry that's coming into the engine matches a detection analytic, that raises an event or an investigative lead. So an example of what this looks like is, or what an analytic might look like very high level. Let's say we're looking for a process that appears to be Microsoft Word, spawning a process that appears to be PowerShell, and making a network connection to some domain and downloading a binary, right? So if you see something like that, that raises an investigative lead that gets investigated by our detection engineering team. They can either throw out or suppress false positives, or they can publish a confirmed threat detection that goes to our customers. Included in a confirmed threat detection is a very wide array of information, including all of the context that happened on an endpoint around the time of the detection. Importantly, for the purposes of this conversation, the confirmed threat detection also includes MITRE attack mapping. So those behavioral analytics that I described a moment ago, whenever we can, we try and tie those analytics to a MITRE attack technique. Now, the confirmed threats themselves, the malicious ones, are all reviewed by our intelligence team. So they review those threats, and if they can tie them to a specific piece of malware or a specific threat, then they do. And that's fundamentally where we get the two lists that this report kind of is based on. The report is organized, I should say, into two lists, right? The top 10 techniques and the top 10 threats. And this is kind of where that comes from. So let's jump right into it. So as you can see here, these are our top 10 techniques. What's interesting, I think, first and foremost, is what we don't see a ton of here, right? Things like initial access. And the reason that is, the reason we don't see so much of that, and we see a lot of the execution and the defense evasion, the persistence and privilege escalation, is because we are focused on endpoints. So if you think about this in the context of the kill chain, right, you really got to think about what parts of that kill chain you're going to get visibility into if you're using primarily endpoint-based security controls. So I'm now going to pass things off to my colleague Aaron Didier and Katie Nichols, and they are going to go into the top 10 threats.
Thanks, Brian. Really appreciate the handoff there. So on this slide, we'll just be discussing our top 10 threats that we've observed in 2020. Knowing the top 10, could be important to you because for us at least, it helps us prioritize our threats and, focus our efforts on just what it is that's affecting our customers the most. So as your eyes kind of wander around this slide and you're trying to interpret just what everything means, those little locks that you see with the money symbols in them, that just denotes that these threats we've observed as ransomware precursors. Identifying those ransomware precursors might be important to you because, right, you are working for an organization and your goal is probably to stop ransomware from getting into your organization. That's kind of a big deal. So let's kick this back over to Katie and have her kind of talk on the whys behind why we're seeing the things that we're seeing.
Yeah, it's so important when you're looking at any, top threats, right? Not just what do we see, but why do we see that? And building off what Brian said, right? We see a lot of threats that we know. I know, and it seems really obvious, but there has to be a named threat for us to be able to identify it. And so what that means is a lot of the top 10 are malware families that we know their patterns, right? Qbot, Dridex, TrickBot, etc. And I think it's important that anyone who's looking at counting anything, think about where you're strong, where you're weak, what your data really shows you. And so I know it's pretty simple, but we see what we know. That's the way it is. And kind of as Brian said on that last slide, right, for techniques, we also want to think about the threats that we see and we don't see. So 60% of these, as Aaron said, are ransomware precursors. What do we not see a lot of? Well, if you kind of skim through, there's really only one group here, TA551. And honestly, there are fewer groups in the top 10 because quite simply, they take a lot more time and data to kind of correlate that group behavior. Of course, we see groups, right? We named groups like yellow cockatoo, silver sparrow, activity clusters throughout the year. It's just that we saw these different malware families a lot more than groups. So that's one pattern to identify. And then you'll also notice, anyone who is the Linux or Mac watchers here, we only have one Mac or Linux threat in our top 10. And that's what we call malware of Schleyer. And check out the threat detection report, much more about why we call Schleyer malware and not just adware. Does some pretty shady stuff. But Schleyer is our only Mac or Linux threat in the top 10. And again, not saying we never see Linux or Mac threats, which is not true. It's just that we see less of them, right? We see a lot of these other Windows families quite more frequently. So just an overview of kind of the top 10 threats. And of course, there are pages on all of these in the TDR. So I'll pass it to Aaron to dive a little bit deeper.
Awesome. Thanks again, Katie, for wrapping up the whys on why we're seeing what we're seeing. Moving on in this next section, we'll just be talking through how we interpret the information contained within the threat detection report. So you can take our threat detection analytics and use them to form your own business decisions. Next slide, please. Okay, so for this, we just kind of look through how our threat pages are formatted, right? So we call out what the threat is. So right here, we can see it's emotet, and we can see that there's an analysis section underneath it. And then over to the right, we kind of call out where it ranks and what percentage of our customers were affected by this threat, right? Maybe that's interesting to you. Maybe that'll help you kind of rank and stack what you're gonna go and pursue and prioritize for, you know, applying your new detection analytics that we hope you glean from our threat detection report. So for us, we primarily focus on the endpoint telemetry, and that's because, you know, our perspective is based around endpoint telemetry and what it is that we're collecting from endpoints. So you're not going to see a lot of us talking about, like, say, network-based activity, or, you know, where the droppers are initially coming from, or anything like that. You're going to see a lot more analysis based around what it is that's going on the endpoint, and, you know, maybe just some interesting little tidbits that we've seen along the way that we thought you might also find to be of interest. So we're going to pass this back on over to Katie to talk on the bottom portion here, you know, concerning what our detection opportunities are.
Yeah, and I kind of was super excited when Aaron talked about informing decisions, because that's something I always talk about, right? Intelligence isn't just intelligence for intelligence's sake, right? We have analysis, and that analysis section on, you know, why was emotet in the top? I had a question come in, right? Why was hafnium not in your top 10? Well, first off, hafnium was in 2021. This covers 2020, but, you know, there are different factors that lead to different things being in this top 10. So we talk about that in analysis, but that's not enough, right? If we just talk about, hey, this is prevalent, So we also wanted to include detection opportunities, right? Each of these threats, we see them quite a bit across different customers. We want to give you the threat detail of, here's exactly how we saw emotet or Qbot or Qbot, so that defenders can make decisions based on that threat intelligence. That is the point of intelligence. And so moving to the next slide, we want to dive into two of our top 10 threats. First one, our number one threat, our only group, TA551. And hat tip to our friends at Proofpoint for this name, which overlaps very much with how we see this activity. So TA551 is just a group that sends out a bunch of emails. It's a cluster of email sending threats. And quite simply, the reason that TA551 is number one is because they have a really predictable attachment name for their initial zip attachment. So you can see there on the left of an average TA551 chain comes in with a password protected zip attachment. And since they kind of were pretty predictable in those names, and since awesome researchers like Brad Duncan share out those names, we were able to identify a lot of those initial emails and associate it with TA551. So that's kind of cool. Thanks to Dalton from our team from this awesome graphic, because it really helps me visualize all the pieces of this intrusion chain And more importantly, you can see two great opportunities to stop this threat in its tracks. Okay, email attachment comes in, user opens the document, it's what users do, and then they have a choice. Maybe someone tries to enable macros. Well, one of the cool things is because we saw a lot of TA 551, we were able to see that in 2/3 of detections, orgs who had a restrictive macro policy who didn't allow macros were able to stop this chain right there. Do not pass go. So that's kind of cool. Of course, sometimes, for various business use cases, you can't restrict all macros. So moves on, does a network connection, right, to download the next stage. And there's another opportunity that we saw. A lot of organizations, if they had restrictive web proxy policies, right, do not allow connections to shady websites, a bunch more TA 551 intrusions got stopped there. So that was kind of cool to see that. And of course, sometimes, right, that next stage installer gets downloaded. This is where, we have a lot of detection opportunities with these lull bins, living off the land binaries. We saw TA 551 switching between regserve 32, which we'll talk about throughout this webinar, and run DLL 32. And if you're not familiar with those, just think of them as like built-in binaries that adversaries love to use to proxy their code. That's how I think of them. And then, all right, they execute that follow-on payload and download a second stage. This is just the first part of this chain. And the second stage payloads varied throughout the year, sniff, zloader, and some other pretty nasty stuff. So that's the analysis, right? Cool, we identified some opportunities to stop it, but let's go a little further to the next slide. Let's take what we know about this threat and try to detect it. Let's feed this to our detection engineers in our case, or in your case, maybe your SOC analysts. So on the screen, we have kind of an average command line from a TA 551 infection. And this is a 2-for-1 detection opportunity. Yes, kind of like a late night commercial here, 2-for-1. Your first detection opportunity here is related to process lineage. And this is something we talk a lot about in our threat detection report that Shane and Brian are going to build on. Just the simple idea that looking for a win word, spawning a child of regserve32.exe, well, in most environments, that probably shouldn't happen. Of course, there's always an exception, but generally we found that's a really great way to detect not just TA 551, but a lot of other threats as well. So that's your first opportunity. Then your second opportunity, all right, taking a look at the command line there from regserve32 that they use. And all right, some of this is, talking to your teammates, your researchers, knowing how these lull bins work. Well, regserve32 usually executes with a DLL file. If you look at that, check it out. That is not a DLL, that's a PDF. So, hey, that's kind of weird. That's your second detection opportunity for TA 551. regserve32 with a non-DLL, maybe specifically a PDF or some other weird file type. So again, the idea is we want to give analysis of our top 10 threats, but not just the analysis, how do you detect it? That's the point of Intel driving those decisions. So that was TA 551. I'm going to tag off to Aaron to dive into Qbot.
Awesome. Thanks for teeing that one up, Katie. So if we're looking at Qbot here in our analysis, we know that Qbot's, it's a pretty predominant banking Trojan that's delivered via phish. And also, if we're keen off of what we've been talking about throughout, it's a ransomware precursor. So this might be pretty hair-raising to know that, Qbot could be lurking in your emails, your end users could be clicking on attachments, and at one point it might turn into, that dreaded day where ransomware does get deployed. Not to spread any FUD or, freak anybody out, but those are just the facts here. But that's all right, because if we're just looking through this slide already, you can sort of see, a point that might be pivotal for your organization to stopping, any ransomware from being deployed, right? Maybe we missed the initial Qbot phish. We didn't see that. That really sucks for the end user because they're going to have a bad day. But at least for us, as defenders, we have a second opportunity to save the organization and the rest of our end users a lot of heartache. And that's Qbot Strike. You can see it right there. If you see a Qbot Strike beacon, that might be that pivotal point in time that decides, are you going to be able to keep the lights on the factory floor? Are you going to keep those widgets pumping out the door? It's all dependent on when you interrupt Qbot and the following payloads that might be, delivered from there. Again, there's not enough BC headache powder or Advil in the world to help us as defenders from getting through a moment like that. So it's these opportunities that we see that, really define our success and failure moving forward. So on our next slide here, we'll just be talking through some of the detection opportunities that we have for Qbot. So talking off of some of those, lull bins, as people call them, or living off the land binaries that Katie was talking about for TA551, we see much of the same for Qbot, right? So if we're going to talk about Qbot, we should talk about the scheduled task, because that's something that we see pretty early in the delivery of Qbot. So scheduled tasks, or however you want to pronounce it, you see scheduled tasks, you see the create flag within the CLI. There's a few other things that we've seen here, right? Like there's NT authority system, so that's your run user. Your task name is just this gobbledygook, ABCD, really it's randomized, but we just put filler text in here to, protect the innocent, right? And then we've got the actual program that they're going to execute, which is regserve32 with the -s flag. That's really interesting, because I don't know about you, but in my system administration days, it was not typical to see regserve32 with any flag, or for that matter, anything in a scheduled task. That's not normal. That's not what you expect to see, right? So that could be concerning. So we'd say that this is probably, a really good opportunity for you as a defender to apply a detection analytic that looks for scheduled tasks being created with regserve32 and the -s flag in it. So to kind of key off the late night, we're getting our 2 for the price of 1 stuff. I mean, we got our like ShamWow or OxyClean, all that fun stuff, and we're just cleaning this mess up. So let's keep cleaning this mess up and talk about a really cool novel detection, opportunity that we have, that one of our detection engineers cooked up, Justin Schoenfield. And he's got a really great blog that you guys can also read that will give you a better perspective on this as well. But we'll just kind of talk through it and get like a high level overview of all the magic that goes on behind the scenes there. So, wow, look at all that math. That's a little overbearing, right? That's kind of scary. Well, it's not all that scary. We used a cipher analysis technique called trigrams. So if you're not familiar with trigrams, right, you might have seen me drinking out of my mug here, I before E except after C, right? Well, if you did a trigram analysis against the English dictionary, you would know that it's really O before U except after Q. Kind of funny, like how the English language works. But to explain trigrams a little bit better to you, and how we're using them to identify random, because we're focusing on the scheduled task name here, and we're trying to identify random. I don't know about you, but in my understanding of randomness in the universe, the only thing that's random is like radioactive material. So we can't like take a Geiger counter and like beep, 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 find malware. That's not going to happen. It's just doesn't work that way. So our detection engineer, Justin Schoenfield, had come up with this really clever technique utilizing the Jacquard algorithm and a further subset of it called Jacquard distancing, and applied it to those trigrams, right? That I before E except after C. And he took those 2 things and then you match them up with one another and you look for overlap. And based off the overlap of multiple different trigrams, you can determine, if a word, right, a string, if a string is actually an English word, a word that, would be within the bounds of probability of being an actual word in the English language. So really cool, novel detection opportunity here. Again, you don't need to go through such lengths, but for us, we believe in like a defense in depth kind of like, structure to things. So again, like this, like identifying RAM scheduled task, it's not just going to identify Qbot. There's a ton of overlap with other threats. It's going to identify other threats within your organization, and not only threats that we call out in our top 10 list, but also ones that didn't make it to the top 10 list. And I think that's really important to highlight, because a lot of the techniques that we've kind of called out within our threat detection report are not, specifically only used by these top 10 threats. And that's a really important idea to, kind of wrap your mind around, because this could help you in other ways that you might not necessarily see currently. So yeah, it's just a really cool threat detection opportunity there. Now this next section, I'm going to kick this over to Brian Donahue and Shane Welcher to, talk more about the techniques behind all this. So.
All right, I am back. So we are going to now talk, we're going to zoom out, right? We're going to step back from the precipice of all this crazy math. And we're going to sort of talk more strategically about like how you can gather visibility into the techniques and the threats used in this report, and then how you can use that visibility to detect them. So we will start by using this Qbot example kind of as a launching off point, right? So this is the not marked up version of that we were talking about like thoroughly throughout the last few slides. And like based on the elements of that detection, the telemetry within that detection that Aaron just discussed, I want to call out a few things for two reasons. One, it kind of teases up some of what we're going to talk about in this bigger picture detection strategy stuff. And two, it also speaks to specific bits of telemetry and detection opportunities and collection requirements that we cover pretty extensively in the threat detection report, both in the threat section that covers Qbot and in the technique section that covers scheduled tasks, and possibly on other pages as well. So the first thing that stands out there, right, is this process lineage. We've got a scheduled task launching regserve 32. Now, I've never been an admin, but a lot of people around Red Canary have, including our friend Shane, who's about to jump in here in a minute. And they all tell me that like this is very abnormal. So the other thing to note here are the CLI for the command line parameters that are running in conjunction with that process, right? So we've got the execution of scheduled task plus certain certain flags, right? Like this create flag. We've also got this random task name value, and also a suspicious task run value in the form of this regserve 32 execution. And then like the one last thing in there that we'll cover briefly is like kind of unusual to see regserve 32 executing a binary from a user profile. So zooming way out, like there are a lot of data sources that you can use potentially to observe malicious or suspicious scheduled task activity. Some of these are fairly specific if we get into Windows event logs. However, I kind of want to focus on sort of the abstract ones that align most readily with the data sources that MITRE ATT&CK collects, or doesn't collect, that they list for each technique, right? So we've got command line, process monitoring, and file monitoring. Now, we went through all of our top 10 and we asked ourselves, for every technique in our top 10, I wonder how many MITRE has listed with each of these data sources. So for process monitoring is listed as a data source that can help you detect every single one of the techniques in our report. Command line monitoring is listed as a data source that will help you detect 9 out of 10 of the techniques in our report. And file monitoring is listed as a data source that'll help you detect 8 out of 10 techniques in the report. And I would argue that it could help you detect credential dumping as well as like certain methods of credential dumping will ultimately end up creating a file. So taking a look at this kind of from a different angle, this is actually based on the 2020 threat detection report. We did not update it, apologies. However, we pulled all of the data last year and we went through and we said, okay, for all of the techniques that we detected across the year, what is the prevalence of the data sources that MITRE ATT&CK has? So basically we pulled all the data, counted up all the data sources, looking at how often they showed up across our data set. As it turns out, process monitoring, file monitoring, and process command line parameters turned out to be the most prevalent of MITRE's data sources, which is exactly why we want to focus on those three throughout the detection section. So I want to introduce my colleague, Shane Welcher. Shane, why don't you take us away and talk about sort of detecting using these data sources in the context of scheduled tasks specifically?
Yep. So the neat thing that we really want to highlight here is this single command line had 3 different opportunities for detection. And we'll kind of touch on that, why that's important here in a little bit whenever you're talking about your detection logic you're implementing within your environment, and just some things you want to keep in mind, like your capabilities individually within your environment. The first one we're going to kind of highlight, obviously, is processes spawning unusual processes. So scheduled tasks spawning some of these may be noisy in your environment, some of them may not be, and that's something you definitely want to keep in mind as you go through the threat detection report. They may not all apply to your environment, but they are things that we definitely do implement at scale in some form or fashion, and we try to provide as much information in that threat detection report for you to be able to implement in your environment as well. The next one kind of is just scheduled task executing with suspicious command lines. We kind of highlighted that weird naming convention. Not everybody is going to have that ability to do that Jacquard algorithm against their scheduled task naming conventions. And this is where you can get creative depending on how you're analyzing your data. All platforms typically allow you to export that data. So if you have some kind of environment you can leverage to ship that data over to implement some kind of algorithm like that against your scheduled task, that's something you can always do. Another thing, and this is highly going to be dependent on how big your environment is whenever I was running I was a system administrator previously, as a big of a pain it was, I tried to know every single scheduled task that was executing in my environment. I took however long it took to go through, monitor all my scheduled tasks, and one by one, just eliminate the ones that I knew. There's always that potential. Yep, go ahead.
I want to jump in just to reiterate, have you reiterate what you're saying. Like at Red Canary scale, it is important for us to be able to use the Jacquard principle because we're monitoring we got an enormous amount of telemetry coming in. But how important is that for most organizations, right?
Yeah, and again, it's definitely going to depend on how large your organization is, because you may have hundreds of thousands of scheduled tasks within your environment, depending on how large it is. But if you're a smaller team, maybe you're just getting started out in this. You have 100 endpoints or less, maybe 200 endpoints or less. You can take that effort and you can really get a leg up on a lot of other teams, because you can go through and just eliminate all your known scheduled tasks and identify those obscure scheduled tasks that may be occurring within your environment. There's again, something I was going to touch on. There's always that opportunity that if you're running some weird bat file as a scheduled task or something, that an adversary may take over that. And that's where some other things like file monitoring kind of can come into play. And that's going to be highly dependent on, I guess, your strategy within your environment. But there's everything that we put in the threat detection report. In some way or fashion, you can try to implement that detection logic. Something else, again, here with the scheduled tasks, we saw, app data within that scheduled task. And it was also with Reg Server 32. If you have that ability to kind of look at multiple different processes and you just look for that little string app data or something like that, any kind of world writable directories, you can catch, not just in this instance of this example we were talking about, but all other sorts of threats. And we'll kind of get in a little bit more detail about each of these pieces of data. Brian, I know we kind of touched on it just a little bit, the file monitoring. We don't have an example here, but go ahead.
I was going to say, we had big dreams that we would be able to tie all of these major data sources back to that specific example. But despite all of our efforts to make file monitoring relevant for it, we couldn't in good faith bend the rules so much that we found an example of file monitoring where you could sort of use that for that example. But to your point, Shane, widely applicable outside of that particular detection.
100%. So we're going to kind of move on into that first one. We kind of talked about process monitoring and how important it is to have this. Typically, if you're ingesting some kind of sysmon data or if you have that EDR capabilities, you're going to have all of this information. And it's typically, when we kind of talk about process monitoring, it's we're kind of referring, and as you go through the threat detection report, we're kind of referring to that parent-child relationship. By no means is this always, is most of it high fidelity, but it can be, and it can provide us with a lot of context when it comes to the detection logic that we're implementing within an environment. If you notice, all of these kind of bullet points start with can. There's a reason why, again, and I kind of touched on that. They by no means are they indicative of malicious behavior. It's just something that sometimes you can add to your, some of your additional detection logic to give you additional context as to why you actually care about this information. So for instance, with our scheduled task stuff that we're talking about earlier, whenever you see it actually execute, it may be spawning off of task engine or service host, it's typically kind of perceived as a sign of persistence. So if you don't know about that binary executing within your environment, you can start making a couple assumptions like, hey, they've already established persistence within my environment. And then you can kind of start digging a little bit further, because you're already kind of behind the 8 ball at that point, if that's the first piece that you're kind of detecting. Something else, some of that process, parent process, and kind of relationship can kind of help identify is like if it's command.exe or PowerShell kind of spawning, you can go look at those parent processes. If you have a way to filter out based on the parent process command line, you can identify like interactive instances of shells. So that may give you additional context, like, hey, this is a hands-on keyboard type of word deal. Another thing to kind of highlight, and these are kind of those outliers where, WinWord probably should never be spawning PowerShell. I say probably because, again, I was a system administrator before, and I have done some really janky things in some environments that I'm not proud of. But, you always have to kind of, this is kind of going to fall back into like knowing your environment, your individual environment. So these are all things to take in consideration as you're going through the threat detection report. They're not, you're definitely always going to have to do some kind of tuning with each piece of detection logic.
So process monitoring on its own, like, yeah, sort of useful. How about process plus command line monitoring?
This is typically where you start getting a little bit more high fidelity of type of logic implemented within your environment. We have a large data source, data set that we can, share with y'all. So like one of the big things we kind of did over the past year, we kind of started digging into MSHTA, and we ended up with, like, I don't know how many exactly, but I'm just going to pretend like it's 15 to 20 different pieces of detection logic that we implement for MSHTA by itself. Whenever you have those multiple pieces of detection logic that are targeting little specific things, and this is kind of what I was referring to earlier with the scheduled task, you can get, you don't need to worry about all of your detection logic for MSHTA catching all of your, every single piece of malicious MSHTA instances. So like for instance, like we had a instance of MSHTA, we started noticing quite frequently they weren't using .hta files. So we just created a detector that looked for MSHTA executing without a .hta within the command line. And it is proven to be very high fidelity. And you can kind of take that same type of logic with all other sorts of binaries that may be typically relying on some kind of scripting file or something to execute. Something else that I don't know how often people use this terminology, but this is just something I kind of frequently talk about in some of my previous webinars and blogs and stuff, is I kind of refer to these as string IOCs. You can use substrings within command lines, really high fidelity indicators of potential malware. You may see, like, the one that I've talked about previously is always a shortened instance of encoded command line. When you see that TAC ENC, like typically 90% of the time, it's probably something related to PowerShell Empire. Kind of going back to my system administrator days, whenever I was writing scripts or anything that were executing with them in my environment, I typically would always tab complete any kind of command that I was executing in my environment. And this is probably going to mainly focus around Windows. Linux is a little bit different, but you can use that type of logic for not just short encoded commands, but any kind of a shortened invoke expression, invoke web request and stuff like that as pretty high fidelity detection logic to detect, anomalies within your PowerShell instances that are executing in your environment. So that command lines are really helpful for identifying that kind of stuff too.
I really love that. I love that idea because it's like takes the philosophical concepts of like detection based on behaviors and detections based on indicators and like mixes them together in a super interesting way.
Yeah, because like how I always kind of look at it is like, why, if this was legitimate activity, why is the administrator using a shortened version of that? It always, like, I start asking those types of questions whenever I see that, because like I said, I've seen a lot of things, especially with the amount of data we get here. And there have been a handful of times that I've seen shortened instances of encoded command where it ended up being legitimate. And I just kind of scratch my head on that because it's something I never would have done. But it's definitely something that does stand out, and you can kind of leverage this high fidelity detection logic. Some other things that we kind of highlight throughout the our threat detection report is just some of the binary naming convention, and this is going to also kind of fall back on your capabilities of how you're able to detect. We have like a database of known Windows processes, and there's some open source stuff out there too, and that gives you some of this information. But like we use some logic that like identifies any kind of like Windows process based off of like a process name, maybe the internal name, maybe the description of the process, as well as a product name, for us to identify if an instance of a binary has been renamed or something. And that can give us additional context where potentially we would have missed that activity if we were just looking for the process execution name. Something else we kind of have, with the rise of Qbot Strike, the ability to do process injection, I guess the bar has been really lowered, and it's easy to do nowadays. And so, we're having to just come up with different ideas on how to detect this stuff. So like one of the ones that we've been working on and trying to develop further is looking for like abnormal command lines. So like a lot of, adversaries are using a lot of Windows processes. And so whenever they are doing this, they may not be passing a command line when typically should be expecting a command line. So we can kind of use this as a idea to really target when a binary may be potentially being injected into. Something else is we kind of see quite frequently a lot of search order hijacking. We see a Windows binary be launching from an unexpected file path. And we're starting to see more and more frequently a lot of this activity going on. And so just is like just a high level overview of this is just to kind of give you that mindset of like why, as you go through that threat detection report, why we do this stuff. And just there's a lot of reasoning behind, I guess, some of this detection logic. The next thing we're going to kind of talk about is going to be our file monitoring. And again, we said we didn't have like a good example for the example we used here, but it does kind of give us a lot of supporting information. Like, so when we saw that scheduled task to execute, we were able to see that, that file path that was included in there. If you don't have that file monitoring enabled within your environment, you're going to have a really tough time identifying where that binary was written to disk initially. So having this stuff enabled allows you to kind of, if you're doing any kind of investigation, retroactive investigation, to kind of go back and look. Same thing like if you are leveraging any kind of Intel feed, you can use file monitoring, just based off of hashes that are being written, if you're able to log those as they're being written. And then two, like if you have that ability to correlate file modifications and executions, like what you typically see with like an EDR solution, it gives you a lot of additional ability to really target in on typical malicious activity. Like for instance, if we're looking for like WScript routing some obscure binary to disk, for the most part, it's really difficult. Creating successful payloads is really hard to do to begin with. So adversaries typically take the easy way out. So they'll typically target world writable paths just so they don't have to really worry about permissions. I kind of look at it like previously, like system administrators we're not necessarily lazy, but like we try to do the easiest path as possible. And it's the same kind of thing a lot of adversaries do get sloppy when it comes to some of this stuff, but every little piece of this information, you know, these data points are very important when it comes to detecting at scale. And so highly suggest using all of these. And Matt's going to talk a little bit about too here in just a little bit, just, you know, if you don't have that ER, I guess, capability, how you can still, you know, leverage some of that data and how it's kind of visualized by itself. Like he uses Sysmon here in a little bit. So we'll kind of, I guess, move on over to that. Brian, did you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, the only thing that I thought was interesting here is that like the report very much lives inside the context of endpoint-based threat detection. And the thing that I like about the inclusion of file monitoring here is it's kind of in a way stepping outside of our like super comfort zone of like the process and command line monitoring stuff and allowing us to kind of talk about like detection is just one part of security, right? But this file monitoring stuff is super useful. Another part, like incident investigation, forensic analysis. So yeah, to move on, don't have to take up any more time here. I'm going to hand things off to my colleagues Adam and Matt, and they are going to talk about testing.
Thanks, Brian. And so again, I'm Adam Mishinchi. I'm director of open source programs here at Canary, and I'm here with Matt Graber, our director of threat research. Matt, can you hear me all right?
I sure can. Hey, everyone.
Fantastic. Awesome. So we've just heard a lot of really great information about detection and about threats and about all these behaviors and the kinds of indicators that we've seen. So as an audience, like, what do you all do about that, right? And hopefully what we will be able to show you all here today is how to boil some of these things down using the information in the threat detection report and all the stuff we've been talking about here to actually set up detections and set up alerting and set up monitoring, and then validate that those things are working through adversary emulation. And really the point of all this is to boil all of this down and say, okay, maybe I can't catch any threat that I could imagine, but how do we start to isolate and really figure out if we're alerting on things that are common or that are maybe a good tripwire and what have you, and be able to do that in a production safe way, because that's really critical. What we've seen historically is that folks who have a lab and they have their EDR set up there or their AD set up there, well, you turn those sensors up to 11. And that's all well and good, but when you roll it out into production, you maybe turn it back down. And so making sure you're doing production safe testing is really, really critical here. And to that end, we also wanted to give examples of how to do these things, not only safely in production, but quickly and easily. So you don't have to spend hours setting up a detection lab or all sorts of wacky monitoring and forwarding things. So what Matt, you're about to show us, right, is some quick and easy ways to test for some of these behaviors based off the information we provide in the threat detection report and see how it flags. So yeah, go. I think we've got a slide up here for scheduled task. Isn't that right?
Yep. Yeah, thanks, Adam. Yeah, so Adam mentioned doing this kind of testing in production. So one of the really good reasons that you want to do this testing and validation is so that ideally, you know, we don't want our adversaries validating our detections in production on our behalf, or at least when they do, or if they do, we'll be confident that our detections will actually trigger in anticipation for them, hoping that they never actually do come. And I'll really be being on data sources here. Brian and Shane covered detection opportunities with a pretty good level of depth. But, you know, like one of my core philosophies is like, you can't detect what you don't see, right? So it largely independent of specific detection opportunities, we want to ensure that we've at least done our due diligence to enumerate potential as many potential data sources as possible, so that we can ultimately decide which sources are valuable to us and which ones may not be, so that we don't have to waste time and energy in consuming data sources that aren't particularly relevant. So if you did want to follow along, you know, this example is pretty simple here. Like in my test, I just literally copied and pasted this into a Windows command prompt. And let me just go over the syntactic breakout of this here, because even though some of this may be obvious to you, some of it may be obvious to me, I still need to remind myself of like what each component is, because there could potentially be a detection opportunity based on each individual component. And that really just helps me get into the practice of thinking about how I want to scope my detections when considering what data sources I want to ingest. So the first one here is schtasks. So schtasks.exe is built-in utility. And Shane alluded to this earlier, the fact that an adversary can copy and paste schtask to any location and file name that they want. So if you were to baseline these processes and potentially note that, hey, like notepad.exe on disk is running, but in actuality, it's the real schtask. So perhaps raise an alert in that case. Next, /create. So obviously we're creating a new scheduled task. The fact that we're requesting a task to be created, to me, is very important, because I like to break things down into like very well-defined, ideally constrained scopes. So perhaps there's going to be different detection optics based on scheduled task creation versus modification. Maybe there's opportunities to detect things based on scheduled tasks actually being triggered. And then there's the actual execution of the scheduled tasks themselves. And so I consider all of these to be possibly related, but independent detection domains, all of which may have their own unique set of detection optics, right? So as far as the triggering is concerned here, my understanding is this will trigger every 3 minutes. You have to give these things a name. So this one is CMD test task. An attacker has full control over this. And as Aaron was mentioning, if an attacker has a particular preference for task names, there's a detection opportunity right there if you're wanting to increase coverage based on threats. Now, that's not necessarily related to coverage for the scheduled tasks technique, those being two independent things. And then what is actually being executed? In this case, just cmd.exe is being spawned, and it's going to write the current date time to this text file.
And Matt, I really love your crafting of this command. And I think we have a telemetry slide coming up here in a second. But I love the crafting of this command because it is so modular, right? The way you could swap out all sorts of little components of it and to test any sort of alerting and detection as you see fit, whether it's changing what it's actually doing at the end of the day or the interval at which it's doing it. And somebody looking at this based off their environment, they could say, oh, I never create scheduled tasks that fire at this kind of interval. And again, it's just another one of those detection opportunities. I love this as an example of that.
Yeah, great point. And yeah, in the previous slide, like the example was schtask, right? But that is just the tip of the iceberg. If we're considering the overarching scheduled tasks technique, schtask.exe is just one procedure, like one of many ways in which a scheduled task could be created, modified, and executed. Now, schtask.exe can have its own independent set of detection opportunities, and we don't want to ignore those, like based on command line here. So that's really why I try to frame things and break things down into their related components so that we can go from the 80% solution of, say, most adversaries do use schtask.exe and break that out even further to, say, using PowerShell or when the API is used directly to execute these things. Next slide. All right. So let's talk about like actual tangible data sources. Brian mentioned the three most prevalent ones, so process monitoring, command line, and file monitoring. All of these will certainly be relevant in the scope of scheduled tasks. There may be others that could be of value. In this stage of our investigation, we don't necessarily know yet. We just want to capture everything that could be relevant and then try to separate the wheat from the chaff. There could also be value in the Windows event log. And sure enough, there is the task scheduler event log, which is not enabled by default, can have some interesting telemetry in there. So Brian, could you unshare your screen so that I can capture it real quick here? And I am mindful of time, so I'll try to be quick here. So I captured as much related telemetry as I could to schtasks.exe being executed. And I want to show you here first the process and command line logging available via 4688 events, which is native to Windows. You just have to enable that via GPO. Similar process logging is in Sysmon, event ID number 1. I really like this one as well because you get binary metadata included. So this is where you could use this event to, say, potentially detect process masquerading. So you have notepad.exe trying to create a scheduled task. You might be able to use this event to notice that deviation. So Sysmon can also capture registry related stuff. So there is some caching that goes on. And what is notable here is that in the registry, you'll get the name of the scheduled task. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and look at the task scheduler event log. Another instance here where you get the name of the task, and then you also get very granular context of what is happening. So the task was registered here. The task actually triggered. Here we have another process creation for cmd.exe. Note the parent process of svchost.exe, not schtasks.exe. And we get process creation events in the task scheduler event log as well, which is pretty cool. And then when the task actually started, we get some context there.
It's crazy,
yeah.
like to me, that a single copied and paste entered command in the command line generated a dozen some odd things that are potentially alertable, and that people can just try this out in their environments right now and see what of all of these things they're able to detect on. I mean, the amount of opportunity is pretty staggering and bonkers when you look at, and this is just one example that you created and is still modular. And I think that's just incredible that it can be that simple.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, the approach I like to take is to just open the floodgates, run a thing, and then do a diff, like a time differential analysis from like right before when I executed the event to right after, and then just see what was populated in the event log or in my EDR, and then just start to weed out like what I deem to be relevant, so that we can really gauge like, you know, what could we consider to be a high fidelity detection, especially based on what an attacker has a direct or indirect level of control over. So yeah, that's about all I have there. Did want to offer some resources here, which we posted into chat. TrustedSec has an awesome guide on if you want to learn more about Sysmon, all things Sysmon, like its capabilities, how to configure it. It's all in that community guide. Olaf Hartong has a great repo if you want to like programmatically like build and merge all your Sysmon configurations together. It's a great project. And then if you want to go test more examples like this out, of course, Canary and the community, we contribute to the Atomic Red Team project. So you'll definitely find many more examples, say, of like scheduled tasks in there. And then if you're interested in those 4688 process auditing events, there's some great Microsoft documentation.
Perfect. Yeah, with that, back to you, Brian. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, guys. That was excellent. So key takeaways. I know we're getting close to the hour here. So big picture on this report, right? The point of it, like, it's going to help you understand the threats so that you can prioritize your focus on, you know, security controls or detection coverage or whatever it is. It's also going to give you guidance on like the visibility that you're going to need to detect adversaries leveraging these techniques. We're also going to there's going to be information in here that you can use to help verify your ability to detect these techniques of these threats with sort of light adversary simulation. And that's about it. So I do want to say, like, thank you to everyone who wrote the report. Everyone's credited in their respective sections in there. They all did a phenomenal job. Huge thank you to the marketing team at Red Canary. And like in particular, I'd like to call out like the people who edited the report. It is enormously long. I think the PDF is like 120 pages or something. And then last, but certainly not least, the design team who not only created, I should say the creative team, who not only created all of the wonderful images in this, helped out with all of the copy, but also formatted that tremendously long PDF. So while the hour is over, we are going to stick around here, and I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Katie, and she is going to walk us through sort of addressing some questions that came in. Katie, do you want slides on or off?
I don't know. Maybe, is there like an ending slide? Yeah, leave it there. We'll do a Q&A.
All right, cool.
So yeah, for anyone who has like an official meeting, you all have been super patient. We dropped the link to both the PDF and the website version of the threat detection report in the chat. So if we did that at the beginning, you wouldn't have listened to us. So that's in the chat. It is live. Go check it out. We love your feedback. We hope it's useful. We just gave you kind of a taste of it here. And so if you have to go to another meeting, all good, but we wanted to just kind of informally answer some questions and just chat a little bit about the report and anything else. So what will be super helpful is if you have questions using that Q&A panel, because otherwise I have to look at chat and Q&A, and that's really hard. But we had a bunch of great questions come in throughout the webinar. And so we will see how many we can get to. So I'll start with Aaron, because as anyone saw, like Aaron's super pumped about trigrams. So Aaron, we had a trigram question about, can trigrams detect foreign languages and symbols? Aaron, I don't know. Do you know?
So that's a really great question. One that we found out the answer to very quickly on our first pass of instituting trigrams. Because, you know, as we've got multiple different customers using multiple different languages, the trigrams that we were using were built around the English language. And if you're going, you know, if your organization is based in, you know, another country and maybe you're a French speaking country, English trigrams aren't going to work for you. So you need to build your own trigrams that are based around the dictionary that is most important to you and your organization, be that English, French, Spanish, whatever. And there's all sorts of like, you know, different frequency counts based on different languages. So yeah, I'd just like to say thank you for asking. That's a really great question, and I meant to cover it, but you've given me the opportunity now, so this is perfect. Thank you.
Love it. Trigram questions, just go to Aaron. Anything math, that's not me. So another question that came in from William, that was a really good one I wanted to highlight. So William's like, hey, why are you talking about Windows stuff? Well, honestly, we felt like scheduled task was something that was accessible to everyone, kind of easy to understand. It's just an example. So throughout the report, you are going to see like non-Windows things. So from the threat side, which is my favorite part, we talk about Schlayer, right? That Mac malware that delivers ads. But there are a bunch of detection opportunities for Schlayer that honestly would help you identify a lot of other Mac threats as well. So there are like non-Windows things in the TDR, which now you can go read. It's just that honestly, Windows is most of our visibility and a lot of what we see. So to answer William's question there, let's see. I see Matt going to answer this question live. So I'm talking about focusing on native Windows events. What might we see in Microsoft Defender for endpoint? So Matt, you're kind of our Microsoft data source guru. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question. And for the webinar, we wanted to make this as accessible as possible to everyone. So we didn't want to just focus on a particular sensor. I happen to think MDE is a great sensor. I use it very regularly, and yeah, like you'll definitely get a good amount of overlap, I would say, from what I demoed. The first being like process logging. Like you may already be familiar with device process events. So like one of the examples I used was if you wanted to try to detect process masquerading, say like notepad.exe /create and all that stuff related to scheduled task creation, you would be able to use MDE to detect that. One of their recent additions to their schema in device process events is they now surface that binary metadata. So you'd be able to compare the original file name baked into the binary against the file name on disk and note that discrepancy. So there's one opportunity there, aside from just the context that you get of like what was the parent process that launched SCH tasks and whatnot. I also find a ton of value from their device events schema. So device events is kind of where they lump miscellaneous events into a standard schema. And the way they break it out is there's an action type field in these device events. And the two that I've seen related to scheduled tasks is there's a scheduled task created and a scheduled task deleted device events action type. So it's worth checking that out. But also just sort of like the approach I would take anyway that I mentioned in the webinar would be like copy and paste that example and then just look through your investigation timeline and see what related events surface. I'm just going off memory here of like what I recall is relevant. But of course, you know, feel free to test that out yourself. Great question.
Sweet. I like it. So a question came in that I'm just going to answer because I'm excited to talk about ransomware. So talking about ransomware attack, the question, is there value in focusing on post-compromised TTPs as well? Can you elaborate on that? So we definitely highlighted, as Aaron said, you know, in our top 10 threats, a lot of pre-ransomware behavior. And like, we get the question a lot, some of you might as well, like, how do you detect ransomware? And I'm always like, well, that's a good question, but like, please ask me, like, what do you detect the pre-ransomware stuff? I think that there is value, and anyone else who has thoughts, like, you can talk next, I promise. Like, I think there's value in detecting ransomware behavior itself, because, for example, like we just talked to one of our incident response partners this week, where they were able to detect ransomware on like a few machines, and then like, bam, like pull the plug, like, let's make sure it doesn't spread laterally. And so you can kind of minimize the impact. That said, I would much rather stop it before it even gets to ransomware. I'd rather stop it, you know, like the graphic that Aaron showed, like at the Qbot strike phase a lot. But I think there is value in kind of detecting the ransomware itself. But we often joke that like the best ransomware detection is like users seeing ransom notes and encrypted files. So that's kind of why we talk about the ransomware precursors. Does anyone want to disagree with me on that? Other people can talk too.
I'll just add to it that I do think that we have, and Aaron can confirm this if I'm wrong, I apologize, but I do believe that we have sort of analytics that are designed around like manipulation of VSS admin. But like by the time that's happening, I don't know the exact sequence of events, but I feel like you're already kind of in trouble. You think that's accurate, Aaron?
Yeah, I definitely say it's accurate, Brian. I'm glad that you brought that up. So yeah, once VSS admin like commands are being issued, that usually means that the adversaries have already gotten their loot. They've ran off with it. It's somewhere sitting on somebody else's server. And, you know, when you've got data sitting on somebody else's server, it's probably you want that to only happen when it's like a cloud provider, not like some random dude crawling through your network. So yeah, I'd say that's definitely, you know, one of those pivotal moments. Another thing that I kind of wanted to bring up, just because, you know, it was in the news lately, like we really like, well, I really enjoy the DFI report. And like there was something that they called out in one of their latest like blogs, and it was the use of rclone. So, you know, maybe you want to start looking at rclone, because rclone's like another one of those techniques to take all of your data, they'll package it up, ship it off, and that could be another one of those pivotal moments where, you know, it's a make or break.
I like it. Yeah, I just dropped a link into that. Like throughout our report, and this is one thing that I'm really glad our team does, like we link to other people's stuff because there's so many people in the community who do great things. And so DFIR report, if you're not following that blog, definitely follow them. They're awesome. We don't get kickbacks, I swear. They're just a great team sharing with the community. Let's see, what other questions? Got a question about atomic red teams. So I'm going to kind of punt to maybe Adam and Matt. Plans on adding new atomic tests, or like any cool atomic test or open source things you want to talk about, Adam?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, and it's timely. What we did while creating the threat detection report is we actually provided testing examples, and almost all of them, if not all of them, were actually pushed upstream into atomic red team where there wasn't already one there. So that's important to know, is pretty much everything you're going to see in the TDR, there's an example for it, and it's already in atomic red team. So we're constantly getting, providing more tests ourselves upstream to that. And what we've seen is a big increase in individuals and organizations also pushing things upstream into atomic red team. And one thing that's kind of a cool teaser is, as MITRE ATT&CK is releasing cloud and container technique IDs and the like there, we've got a bunch of very cool tests inbound from some organizations doing some very fun work there. So keep your eye on atomic red team for more cloud and container tests in the near future.
Excellent. Anything you wanted to add, Matt? Cloud and container, I'm excited about that. Hopefully it's more than just coin miners. I know the attack team is looking for anything other than coin miners in the container world.
No, I think Adam captured everything. I mean, one recurring theme for me is like how I think about coverage. So like what I think is great about Atomic Red Team is like you can just take the existing suite of tests and you don't have to be a subject matter expert on that related technique to get up and running to execute a thing and then see what is generated in your telemetry on the other end, and to start thinking about how to incorporate detection logic into your organization, or to use it to validate that your sensors are running, or that your vendors are supplying the expected alerting on the other end. Now, as far as like coverage is concerned, we have like a sister project to Atomic Red Team called Atomic Test Harnesses, which we're like slowly incorporating functionality into that. It's a relatively expensive process, but we're doing our best to recreate as many components of an attack technique as possible so that we can automate really like any aspect of the technique that an attacker has control over. We want to be able to automate that. And so some of the tests in Atomic Red Team will take Atomic Test Harnesses as a dependency. So like one example is MSHTA. So we have like very extensive functionality related to MSHTA, so you can get like exceptionally granular control over all of the minutia of that technique and all of its like sub variations, and then you could pull all that into Atomic Red Team as well if you chose to do that.
Excellent. Thanks, Matt. There was a question, I don't know where it went, like Zoom is difficult, but there's a question, someone said, oh, here it is. Future reports, would we expect to see more on like the Unix, Linux side or OS X side? Which is a great question. I'm going to drop in our blog posts, a link to our Red Canary blog, because there's an awesome team. We have folks on our cloud workflow protection team who look at Linux threats. And honestly, like, to give you a little peek behind the curtain, this year we kind of talked about like, hey, should we break down by Windows, Linux, Mac? And when we looked at our data, we just didn't have the data to support. Like it would be like Windows is this much and then Linux and Mac are this much. And we felt like it wouldn't be like an honest way to represent the data. That said, like from an Intel perspective, I'm hoping that we'll like get more visibility into Linux and Mac threats. If you saw like our Silver Sparrow blog a few weeks ago, like we definitely see Mac threats and we see Linux threats. I'm hoping we can cover those more. So that's my hope for the future and maybe future TDRs. That's really helpful feedback as well. Like for us, hey, what should we be looking at? So I'm hearing like more Nix things and Mac OS, which we care about too. But yeah, as we see things, keep an eye. You can subscribe to our blog if you're interested for the latest things we're seeing on all of the operating systems, not just Windows. We're very Windows centric today, but there are multiple systems to worry about. All right. Oh man, we got all kinds of questions. This is a question, industry breakdowns. So this is something we had last year in the TDR that we didn't do this year. We had a breakdown by like, okay, which techniques are most common or which threats are most common in certain industries. And similar to the Mac Linux answer I just said, like to be totally transparent, we just felt like the data wasn't there. like we didn't see a really obvious trend that like, oh, Qbot's way more prevalent in banking versus TrickBot or Emotet. And so we felt like, hey, let's focus on, the patterns we do see and sharing those with the community rather than trying to like be like, oh, there's industry breakdowns that we didn't see. But again, that's something that we will try to keep an eye on in the future. Like, if there are trends by industry, sometimes we see smaller trends, just not in our top 10. But if we see those, good feedback, we'll try to include those in the future.
And I think an interesting point on that one is often when you'll see industry trend statistics, right? It's not actually data about the industry from an analysis perspective. It's often like, oh, they really saw a lot of banking things. They must just have a lot of banking customers, right? And so being able to tease those sorts of data out in a meaningful way to give like a broad strokes answer, I think is important. And you need to really have good evidence behind it. And we've seen as an industry that is not always the case when you see those kind of generalizations.
I think it also goes back to our endpoint focus, right? Like a lot of our visibility comes from endpoints and like workstations. And so the place where I think you'd start to see some differentiation, like some really clear differentiation, is if you had both an endpoint-based product and like operational security product, right? Where you might get visibility into something like some widget maker at a factory or an MRI machine or something along those lines.
We like the widget theme today. Aaron also talked about widgets. So the widget factory, the widget industry is we don't see many widgets. I don't even know what widgets are. Cool. So we're a little over time and I'm getting a little hungry. But panelists, if you all can just scroll through the questions, we have so many good questions and like limited time, we're already over. And I'm hoping my internet won't go out because it sucks sometimes. But if there are any other last questions that anyone wants to answer, feel free to pipe up. Otherwise, you can always reach us. I think it's info@redcanary or on Twitter, and we'll try to like answer as many questions. Various of us hang out on Twitter, so that's probably a good place if you have additional questions we didn't get to. Oh, we got a Windows event log question. Matt, I see you want to answer that live. So, okay, James is a fan of ID 4688. What's the response? I'm not understanding this question. Matt, help me understand the question and answer to this one.
Yeah, good question, James. So again, for everyone listening, 4688 is the Windows native event that you can enable via GPO to get that built-in process and command line logging. The sysmon equivalent, which I had to go through very quickly in my demo, the corresponding event would be event ID number 1 in sysmon. And the thing that I called out that I particularly like about the sysmon event is that it surfaces the binary metadata. So like that original file name that would say allow me to detect process masquerading is great. Good question.
Cool. All right. Well, I'm a little overwhelmed with the questions. In general, I'll try to hit a few of them. You need lots of different data sources. We focus a lot on endpoint, but we look at other data sources too. We could have an argument over endpoint versus network. The only right answer is you need both. So there's that one. We got lots of other questions. We've got a few questions about comparison year to year. So I just wanted to highlight that from the threat detection report webpage, you can go back and look at previous years. The challenge and why we didn't necessarily do like a PowerShell's increased X percentage is because honestly, it's like comparing apples to oranges because of the MITRE ATT&CK sub-technique change. So like, if you look at the report, there are parent techniques and sub-techniques. And so trying to compare like what used to be a technique to what's now a sub-technique and the percentage there, it gets a little wonky. So you can absolutely do that kind of analysis yourself, but we felt like it was just a little too confusing to dive into that. And it's okay, Adam Pennington and the attack team. No apologies. We like sub techniques. As you'll see in the report, it's kind of cool. You can get more granularity on, how you do detection. So it's useful. It was just a transition, but it's okay.
And I've seen a reoccurring theme across a few of these questions. A lot of questions from existing customers just asking if they should be concerned about the detection analytics that we outline in here or if they're protected by them. I just wanted to put this out there for whoever's, sticking around and still biting their nails wondering. The detection opportunities that we've called out in our detection, our threat detection report here, a lot of them, all of them rather, are being utilized by the Red Canary engine currently. So you don't need to worry so much about those specific analytics, but there might be other places within your organization where you can apply them. And in addition to that, there are definitely other insights in here that you can operationalize across your organization that we can't necessarily do from our perspective, right? Like we can't turn off your VBA macros, for instance. So there are little tidbits in there to glean from and learn off of as well.
That's a great point, Aaron. Yeah, I would just say, no one has perfect visibility, all about the defense in depth approach. Like, we really hope that our report, though, can help you all. And just to highlight what Aaron said, like literally the way we write this report is my team went and said, hey, for our top 10 threats, what are the best detection analytics that help us catch this most reliably? And then we shared them. And our goal, honestly, we want you all to go out there and kind of kick adversary tail along with us. So we really hope the threat detection report's useful to you. I will just drop that, or if someone else can drop it in the chat one last time. I dropped it before, but it's now available, of course, PDF and web version. So please check that out. If you have any other questions, hit us up on Twitter. We have all kinds of things going on. Thank you all so much for coming. And with that, we will let you all get back to your Wednesdays. Thanks and have a great one, everyone.